There's been a lot of scrutiny placed lately on online platforms regarding the role they play in communication, discussion, and debate. Specifically in question are the moderation, influence, and censorship that various online platforms apply. This scrutiny comes from all quarters, each for its own reasons, but almost universally due to a concern that the judgment that each platform uses to guide its decisions in moderation of content and display of content do not match up to how they ought to operate. And this reflects the question that is not modern but is taking on a very modern form now of what these platforms represent and to what, if anything, they should be beholden. Are these platforms just services offered by companies, or have they taken on a role that is somehow greater in their use as broad communication, the arena for debate, discussion, representation of ideas, and often, for many individuals, a kind of source of truth? We can postulate a future in which these platforms play even more significant of a role than they do now, becoming a ubiquitous medium for discussions and decisions on a national and even global scale, and where the outcomes are very significant. At that point, what requirement is on them, and in what way, to organize and moderate their content? An obvious consideration is the use of legislation to help control and equalize how platforms manage their information and display it to each individual. In this way, it becomes more of a utility, a governed marketplace, than simply a website operated by some company. But this legislation in itself is not such a simple answer. The implications of how the legislation would apply, who would make the decisions for how moderation, content control, and censorship should be applied. There are certain obvious cases, those of perhaps hate speech, threats of violence, but when these platforms become so ubiquitous and such a source of truth, then cutting off even those edge threads becomes much more significant of an act. You are of necessity forcing a censorship of what anyone may see, what anyone may observe, in the interest of reducing certain potential negative outcomes. That's not such an obvious choice to make, and the outcomes of that, the implications of that, are also potentially concerning, not the least of which is where and how to draw the line, and who gets to draw the line, and who gets to decide where to draw the line, and so forth. It becomes caught up in a very political and legal battle. On the opposite side, if you leave things ungoverned and still consider these platforms to just be a service offered by the various companies, then you get a kind of chaos, with each organization administering control and censorship in whatever way they deem most appropriate and ethical. But of course, each organization will view this in a slightly different way. And we see this now already in the schisming of platforms and their communities. And you could view this as well in a potentially positive way, with a free marketplace of services and communities and thought, each service growing organically with its own community and finding its niche, and in such a way having a broad swath of such communities. But often in reality it doesn't work this way. We often see, in today's reality, when one platform attempts to crack down on perceived infractions or concerning ethical issues, they perforce eject a section of their community that section then goes and potentially forms its own separate community on its own separate service. And it seems to many on both sides of that schism that something positive has happened. The original platform now has more stability, has more unanimous discussions. They've gotten rid of fringe elements that were considered negative. Likewise, the new platform and its community feel that they have gotten away from the censorship and difficulties presented by the former platform, and now are free to have their own discussions without such restriction. But often what really happens is that each of these platforms and each of its communities have left the arena of true debate or discussion, and we observe then the common phenomena of the creation of echo chambers, wherein not only is there a lack of true debate, original thought, outside ideas, but that lack is not even perceived by the majority of the people engaged in that discussion. And so in effect you create a greater divisiveness and a greater divide between the members of each of these virtual communities. And yet very often these are the same people interacting in everyday life, though they would never interact on these platforms. But it's much more rare to go outside these days and see someone on their soapbox on the street pronouncing their opinion and engaging others in debate right there and then. On the rare occasion you do see it, it's usually on a video on one of these platforms that someone else filmed. And so the question of with whom you debate and what ideas are presented and how you feel about one another becomes almost hidden. But as we've noted, if we try to stay away from this issue of schisming by forcing some restrictions, perhaps even legislation, upon it, you're in effect only squelching that debate in a new way. It's hard to determine a correct outcome at this point. But there is a very real danger that the pressure and scrutiny being placed on these platforms by many different parties who perceive a negative, whether real or not, is almost irrelevant. Certainly these platforms are growing and adapting as our entire society and its representation online is growing and adapting, and how we handle that must also change. But there is a very real danger that the level of scrutiny and the loud voices behind it will cause a chain of actions to go into effect and entrench certain approaches and views to how these platforms and the discussion that occurs on them should be handled. And that this will happen long before we as a society are truly ready to come to any kind of conclusion on how they should be handled. And at that point, we will be in trouble, because the ability to not only debate, but to discuss and debate about the manner of our debate is a very delicate and difficult issue, and not one that should be frozen into one form too quickly. Certainly not when so many things are in motion and unknown. There are a lot of difficult questions. Are we taking these platforms too seriously? Should we attempt, however wise or unwise, to go back to a viewpoint in which discussions occurred but were not taken so seriously simply for the demerit of being online? That rather than being viewed as a source of truth, these platforms were viewed as a source of entertainment. Or, on the other hand, should we take these platforms all the more seriously for being so ubiquitous? Should we take a hard, long look at how to manage these things? Who should control them? Should it be left to the individual operators of a company? Or should some broader oversight be taken? If we have broader oversight, where should this oversight lie? Should we legislate? If so, how? By whom? Where do we draw the lines in terms of censorship? These are all very difficult questions, and ones that need to remain in motion. At the heart, we are asking, when does a website offered as a service by a company cease to be just that and start to become an open platform for the exchange of ideas? And when this change is observed, what is the ethically, morally, practically, and legally correct way to respond to it?